Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Not only does California agriculture generate $50 billion in revenue annually, it accounts for almost 20% of all U.S. agriculture, and it's also a significant source of California's greenhouse gas emissions. There are several major state programs aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions that come from agriculture. The question is, are they working? The answer to that question is actually the subject of a report done by our guest today. He is Frank Jimenez. He is an ag policy expert with the non-partisan legislative analyst office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me, Maddy.
So let me ask you this. Can you briefly go over some of there's a lot of goals here when it comes to reducing greenhouse gases, and they've changed over time. Can you go over them for our audience?
Yeah, of course. So at the time of our report, California had 2 major greenhouse gas reduction goals. The first one was to limit statewide GHG emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. The state achieved these goals early and has continued to maintain these reductions. The goal was further extended to limit GHG reductions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So we're still in the process of meeting those goals. When you compare the 2 goals, the 2030 goals are much more aggressive than the 2020 goals. So rate of reductions need to occur at a much faster rate.
I think that's a very, very good point. People kind of got like a little, in some ways, I think people are kind of complacent. Hey, man, we hit the original goals a year in advance. We're good. And then they changed the goals and made it more difficult for 2030. And now you're saying in your report is it's a much steeper curve here. I mean, we're really gonna have to get aggressive if we're gonna meet these new 2030 goals. And I think that's a good point for people to understand. So what's agriculture's role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so the agricultural sector represents about 8% of statewide GHG emissions, making it the fifth largest source in the state. Most of these emissions, around 70%, come from livestock activities, with a smaller amount coming from fertilizers and fuel use. So that's going to be fuel use using tractors or diesel pumps.
Yeah, you would expect. I mean, you're looking at this topic and say, well, I would think the biggest thing would be pumps and tractors. And actually, no, according to your report, I mean, livestock like 70%, and you're saying that fuel is 8% in your report. So it's like that kind of shocked me that it's so much basically on livestock and manure, in which we're gonna have to talk about, I guess. So let me ask you this: you note that, like I said, the largest source of ag emissions, methane emissions, comes from these sources. What is the impact? What's the different impact between methane and carbon dioxide on the environment when it comes to ag?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the agricultural sector is the largest source of statewide methane emissions, about 56% of statewide methane emissions. Methane is a short-lived climate pollutant, which remains in the atmosphere for a much shorter period of time when compared to carbon dioxide or CO2. But methane is 25% times more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere when compared to CO2. So that makes methane reductions very important.
Right, it's more intense. But it kind of struck me in your report, is saying that methane has a lifetime in the atmosphere of about 12 years, but carbon dioxide, thousands of years. But methane, when it is in the environment, it's what you said, 25 times more potent when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So short-term, methane's a big deal. Long-term, carbon dioxide's a big deal. And so, yeah, so ag is a big producer of methane, which has kind of this short-term intense effect, and then it goes away in about 12 years. So it does mean that we could probably correct the problem if we got aggressive about reducing emissions in methane, I suppose. So what are the main sources of methane emissions when it comes to agriculture? We talked about livestock. That's pretty important, obviously.
Yeah, so most of the methane emissions from the agricultural sector, as you mentioned, come from livestock. It makes up nearly all of the agricultural methane emissions. The largest sources are manure management and enteric fermentation from dairy farms. Methane comes from manure management when manure is stored in wet conditions, such as manure being flushed into open lagoon ponds. And methane also comes
to make it kind of obvious for those of us that are not dairy people. So they have Cows give manure. And what they do is they clean out the manure from the stalls and they flush it into a lagoon.
Yeah, the dairy farms on the state are relatively large. When you have that many cows producing that much manure in the stables, an efficient way to move all of that is to just flush it out of the stalls and into an open air lagoon, which is an optimal place for methane to be produced.
Right, and so looking at your thing, there are 1,300 dairies in California, 1.7 million cows. I did my graduate law work at University of Wisconsin, so we thought we were the dairy state, but apparently no, it's California's the dairy state. Happy cows and all of that. And milk production, it's like $7.3 billion business, at least back in 2019. So it's a significant industry in the state. So what are the goals in place to reduce those emissions? What does the state plan to do to meet those goals?
Yeah, so the state has one major goal related to dairy methane emissions, and that's to reduce methane emissions from livestock manure management to 40% below 2013 levels by 2030. Currently, the state has attempted to meet these goals by providing incentives through grant programs. However, CARB and CDFA both have the authority to regulate entities starting in January 2024 to help meet these goals, but these regulations need to prove that they are technologically and economically feasible for farmers.
Right. Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the key state programs in reducing greenhouse gas emissions that come from agriculture. How much of the funding they receive, and is it enough? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. There are several state agricultural programs that are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and sequestering carbon when it comes to agriculture. They're administered by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, as well as the California Air Resources Board. And this is what's important. The state's policy goal is to maximize greenhouse gas emissions and methane reductions at the lowest cost possible. We're talking with Frank Jimenez. He is an ag policy expert with the non-partisan legislative analyst office, who's recently written a report assessing California's climate policies regarding agriculture. So what are some of the state programs that have been implemented to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What are the big ones?
So the state has four major GHG reduction programs within the agricultural sector. The first one being the Dairy Digester Research and Development Program, known as DDRDP. And it provides grants to dairy operations to implement digester projects which capture methane from manure on dairy operations. There's the Alternative Manure Management Program, also known as AMP, which provides grants to livestock and dairy operations to implement practices that reduce methane emissions that are not related to digesters, so making more manure managed in dry form instead of liquid form. There's the Healthy Soils Program, which provides grants to agricultural operations to adopt practices that improve soil health and sequester carbon from the air into the soil. And then there's the State Water Efficiency and Enhancement Program, known as SWEEP, which provides grants to agricultural operations to implement projects that reduce on-farm water use and GHG reductions.
So there's lots of grants and incentives out there to encourage farmers to kind of reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So let me ask you about this. All these state programs seem to come with financial incentives, so that reduce the cost of adopting these technologies and practices. I'm wondering how much money is being allocated to do this, and how many projects are actually being funded?
Yeah, so going through the four programs that I mentioned, DDRDP at the time of the report had received $195 million for 117 projects. AMP had received $60 million in total funding for 114 projects. Healthy Soils had received $40 million for 675 projects, and SWEEP had received $81 million in total funding for 828 projects. But in the state's recent budget surpluses, these programs have all received augmentation. So that funding is still being awarded to projects as we speak.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that because the state went from a surplus to a deficit, and they're cutting programs, thinking, gee, are they going to cut these programs? My guess is, who knows what's going to happen in any budget, but my guess is these programs are not going away. They're going to stay in some form. But it's interesting. And by the way, one thing we can talk about later is, the dairy digesters. That's basically for larger farm operations. That's why they have that alternative manure management, according to your report, because smaller farms, the upfront costs are too much for the dairy digesters. So they need another program that will work for them, so that manure management program kind of helps the smaller farmers manage the situation. After you reviewed these programs, you came away, you had three basic takeaways. What were they?
Yeah, so overall in the report, we found that all these programs have merit and likely incentivize actions that reduce GHG emissions and sequester carbon. However, GHG benefits for the programs are likely overstated in some cases, and this is due to shortcomings in the methodologies used to calculate the benefits, uncertainty in whether the projects that are being implemented are used in ways that achieve the estimated benefits, and uncertainty on the degree to which these programs and incentives, the practices that are adopted, are being maintained long-term, and it varies amongst the various programs amongst these three kind of findings.
Yeah, and I think that the focus, remember, is what we talked about at the top of this segment, and that is that the state's policies to maximize greenhouse gas emissions and methane reductions at the lowest cost possible. And what you're saying in your takeaways, what I'm reading is, hey, yeah, they work, but we don't know exactly how well they work because the methodology of assessing the benefits is not quite accurate. And so we need better measurements to know how the programs work generally, but also how specific sub-programs under each one of these work the best, right? And that seems to be what you're arguing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's 100% correct. Updating the methodologies themselves